Boldwood presents The Daughter She Gave Away, written by Lisa Timoney, and read by Helen Keeley. Prologue. 6 months ago. Meg. Meg tapped the screen of the phone she'd attached to a tripod in the old kitchen table, switching the camera to selfie mode. She blinked, finding it hard to believe it was her own gaunt face staring back at her. She turned her head from side to side, knowing that even 6 months ago she'd have killed for those razor-blade cheekbones. She only had them now as a byproduct of dying. How bleakly ironic. Suddenly, she had a memory of Grace's hands on her cheeks when she was a small girl, maybe 4 or 5 years old. Meg had been putting the rubbish out when her daughter woke from a nightmare. Frightened, her little girl came downstairs to find the house empty, her mother gone. When Meg came back inside, Grace flew at her, gripping her so tightly that Meg could still now feel her thin arms around her.
"Mummy, I thought you'd gone away,"
Grace said through hiccuping sobs. Meg kneeled down and took her in her arms. "I wouldn't leave you, silly." Grace pulled back, taking Meg's face between her soft palms. She stared at her, eyes huge and wet, her bottom lip trembling.
"Promise you'll never leave me. Never. Ever."
Meg smiled. "I won't leave you, Grace. Not ever."
"Do a promise."
Grace's tiny voice was so earnest. Meg had smiled and shaken her head. The idea of leaving her little girl was preposterous. It was the last thing she would ever do. "I promise." She kissed the top of her head. "I'll never leave you, my beautiful girl. Never." She'd meant every word. And now she was breaking that promise, and it was shattering both their hearts. Swallowing down tears and fixing her gaze on the screen, she opened her lips to try out the words she'd practiced in her head since her diagnosis 4 months ago. The words she'd tried and failed to say to her daughter before she screamed at her to get out of her room. If she listened carefully, she could still hear the sound of Grace crying. Her anguish now carried down from her bedroom and soaked into Meg's spongy heart. She thought it was already full up with a heady combination of love and pain, but it seemed there was room for more. Her parched tongue stuck to the roof of her mouth. That could be a side effect of her medication, but she knew it was more likely due to the fear gripping her stomach and squeezing it into a sickly ball. The thought of death frightened her. Of course it did, but filming this confession scared her more. Grace refused to listen to her when she tried to explain, so if Meg wanted to tell the truth of what happened, she had no choice but to speak to this camera instead. Family life as they knew it had ended. The agonizing knowledge that she wouldn't be around to rebuild the safe, trusting world she and her husband Simon had tried so very hard to create made more tears collect in her eyes. She took a sip of water from the glass by her elbow, then wiped her eyes dry. The wooden slats of the dining chair were hard against her bony back. When she shifted position, she noticed the ring light she'd placed on the table behind the tripod to soften her features highlighted her jutting clavicle, reminding her of those awful pictures of displaced, starving children she saw in the news. She leaned across the table and switched the glare off. Even that small movement made her queasy. No amount of good lighting could disguise the sunken hollows under her eyes, or the fact her eyelids were now naked, eyelashless. She blinked, thinking how much she looked like a fish or a reptile. She breathed in through her nose and lay her palms flat on the table. The wood, scarred from stubby pencils pressed too hard on paper and cups, dropped from toddlers' slippery fingers. The papery skin on the back of her hands made uneven crisscross patterns over protruding green veins. They were the hands of an old person. It wasn't fair. She was only 35. These hands should be applauding her beloved child at the end of school plays or catching balls on sunny afternoons in the park. Instead, they had tried to hold her daughter to her chest while her half-child, half-woman body shuddered with heaving sobs after she learned how she'd really come into this world. Meg swallowed. She couldn't afford to think about all the things she was going to miss, or the fact that she and Simon should have shared the truth with their daughter from the start. Over the last 14 years, they'd told themselves and each other that it had never been the right time. They were too happy or too sad, or Grace wasn't old enough. Then, in a heartbeat, she was going through puberty, so better to wait until the teenage hormones subsided. How cruel, Meg thought, that her time had run out before any of them were ready. Now Grace might never forgive her for what she and Simon had done back then, and all the lies that had followed. And it was too late for her to ever make amends. She lifted her head and waited for the nausea to subside. She had to focus. It was time to film what she needed to say. Simon had understood it might be too hard for a 14-year-old to absorb all the information right now, especially when she was still reeling after learning her mother only had weeks to live. This video was an attempt to explain, apologize, and beg for forgiveness, and hopefully show Grace there was a way she could find comfort if she was brave enough. It was the only way Meg could think of to make sure Grace knew every detail of what happened and could digest it in her own time. She adjusted her headscarf, took another sip of water, pulled her dry lips into a fixed smile, and pressed record. Chapter 1. Present Day. Cassie. The swooshing started in Cassie's abdomen, rose up to lift her lungs, holding her breath in her throat. Once she'd believed she'd never experienced that kind of joyful exhilaration again, so she stopped on the pavement to savor the moment. She wanted to catch it in a jar and store it away so she could bring it out to marvel at when life wasn't quite so shiny. Luke turned and squinted across the road at her.
"What are you doing?" he said. "Come on."
She wanted to tell him how gorgeous he looked, his strong arm reaching down to hold their 7-year-old son, Alf's, hand. She wanted to say that just the sight of him and Alf in that unremarkable moment made her heart soar in a way she thought she would never feel again. After everything that had happened before, she was so grateful Luke and Alf were hers, and that at almost 40 years old, her life was better than she had ever thought possible. It was perfect. They were perfect. Instead, she said, "Coming," and followed them across the road and into the pub. After the brightness of the May sunshine, the dimly lit interior felt gloomy. The hoppy smell of spilled beer grew stronger as the door creaked closed behind them, and the swooshing feeling at her centre disappeared, replaced by flat disappointment. The pictures on the pub's website had led her to believe this was the ideal venue for the party she was planning for her upcoming birthday, but the photos were clearly misleading. They'd made a wasted trip. She was about to express her disappointment to Luke when a young man with a goatee appeared through a door behind the bar.
"Cassie?"
he said, dipping out from behind and approaching her, arm outstretched.
"I'm the manager, Ross. We spoke on the phone."
"Hi," she said, shaking his hand. She decided she may as well let him show them around since they'd made the trip. "This is my husband, Luke, and this is Alf." She smiled down at Alf, suppressing an amused smile when he offered his small hand to shake, mimicking his father.
"Good to meet you, young man,"
said Ross, shaking Alf's hand and mirroring his serious expression. Ross turned back to Cassie.
"That's the formalities out of the way, so if you follow me upstairs, I'll show you the room you were interested in."
He marched across the scuffed wooden floor to the far side of the bar, where he held open a door leading to a narrow staircase. At the sound of a phone trilling, he grimaced.
"That's the booking line. Why don't you three go up and have a look around? I'll join you in a minute."
When the door closed behind them, Luke said,
"I like him. He's all right."
"All right, how?" Cassie reached the top of the steps and let out a relieved breath when she found herself in a square room with huge windows on 3 sides. The sunshine flooded in to illuminate a black and white checkered dance floor in the centre. This, at least, was exactly like the pictures on the website. Better.
"Take note, Alf,"
said Luke.
"This is an important life lesson."
Cassie smiled as Alf looked earnestly up at his father, as if he was some kind of guru. Luke was always passing his wisdom on to his son. In any other man, she was sure she'd find it trite, but Luke's lessons were always so thoughtful and considered that she often ended up learning something herself. That was what she got for marrying a counsellor, she supposed.
Your mummy made the appointment with Ross, right?
Alf nodded, his hazel eyes trained on his father's.
And when we turned up today, Ross spoke to your mother first, using her name and shaking her hand before mine.
Yeah.
Alf's eyebrows met in a confused expression, so cute that Cassie wanted to scoop him up and kiss his round face.
And that was the right thing to do, but too often that's not the case.
Patriarchy, said Cassie, nodding at Alf as she grasped the point Luke was making, and the swoosh of joy returned. She fought the familiar voice in her head, whispering that she didn't deserve such a lovely man, or the son they both adored. She tried to silence the sound, forcing her feet to move across the dance floor, imagining music pumping from the speakers either side of the record deck, set up near the far wall, and the room filled with people who loved her.
I don't get it,
said Alf.
Even if a woman is the person in charge, often when another man is present, men talk to them first, because they presume they're automatically the authority figure. Ross didn't do that. He clearly understands a man isn't always in charge, and that's a good thing for everyone.
So, Mummy's in charge?
Always, said Cassie. She took Alf's hand and pulled him to the dance floor, swaying in time to imaginary music.
Unhelpful,
said Luke, shaking his head. He shoved his hands into the pockets of his jeans and gave a theatrical sigh. You're right. Sorry. Cassie twisted Alf in a circle, then moved him to face her, tugging him along as she pretended to waltz around the space. Sometimes I'm in charge, sometimes Daddy is, but mostly no one is because we are equals and work together.
Am I ever in charge?
Asked Alf through giggles as he tried to keep up with Cassie's footwork. God, no, said Cassie. You don't get to be in charge until you stop picking your nose and you eat your green beans. If we put someone who makes terrible decisions in charge, where would we end up? A polite cough sounded over Alf's shoulder. Cassie stopped dancing and turned to see Ross at the top of the stairs. His cheeks pinched as though trying to repress a smile. He doesn't really pick his nose, she said, pulling Alf in front of her and resting her hands on his chest.
I try not to, said Alf, but I definitely don't eat green beans because they're gross.
Noted, said Ross. I like a person who knows their own mind.
He looked around the light-filled space.
What do you all think of the room?
Cassie took in the disco lights suspended on the ceiling, the mirror ball glinting in the sunshine, the red velvet-covered seats around small tables on the periphery of the room, and could easily visualize welcoming their friends to her 40th birthday party here in 3 months' time. I love it, she said. It's perfect. There was that word again. Perfect. At last, everything was as it should be. The past was in the past, and nothing could spoil the life she had now. Chapter 2. Present Day. Cassie. The rattle of pens dropping into pencil cases began as soon as the bell rang to signal the end of the school week. Before the inevitable squall of 32 Year 10s discussing plans for the weekend hit its crescendo, Cassie raised her voice. And don't forget to fill in the careers questionnaire before our next lesson on Monday. They didn't respond, but she didn't mind. Some of her colleagues insisted the students carried on with their work until they gave permission to pack up. But even at 39, Cassie still remembered how it felt to hear the bell signalling the end of Friday's lessons when she was a teenager. Sometimes it would be a rush of excitement if there was a party or plans for a shopping trip with friends. At other times, she might just feel an overwhelming exhaustion, a need to be out of the school building with all its rules and expectations, and back in her own bedroom surrounded by her posters of Charlie Simpson from Busted. From behind her desk in room D2, Cassie watched her form gather their belongings. She was glad one of their personal and social education sessions was timetabled for last thing on a Friday afternoon. It gave her the opportunity to catch up with her form. She felt like a shepherd, always trying to steer them along the right path, often running in one direction or another, trying to keep an errant student on the right track. Manel swung his rucksack at one of the girls in a ritual Cassie recognized as teenage flirting. She caught his eye, and he dropped his bag, giving her his trademark impish smile.
Sorry, miss.
When all books and pencil cases were deposited in overstuffed rucksacks, Cassie said, Have a good weekend, everyone. She grinned at the hurried mumbles in return as they jostled their way out of the door. Her classroom in the English block always seemed eerily quiet when the students left, even though she could hear voices from outside. There was an unnatural stillness inside the room. An absence. It was a feeling that never failed to unsettle Cassie, so she gathered her things quickly and set off for the staff room. Becca, the head of English and Cassie's closest friend, was sitting at a desk facing the far wall when Cassie arrived. She turned as Cassie sank into a chair and let out a huff of air.
Another week over, thank the Lord,
Becca said.
Anything fabulous planned for the weekend?
Cassie wrinkled her nose. Just a bit of party planning for the big 4-0, unless a 7th birthday party at Goals counts as fabulous. Becca threw her head back.
Ugh, absolutely not. That's the stuff of nightmares. I can't begin to express the gratitude I feel that I never, ever have to go to another kid's birthday party again.
6 years older than Cassie, Becca had had her family in her early 20s, so both her daughters were at university. When the youngest moved away, Becca and her husband discovered they didn't have much in common anymore and amicably parted ways. But the split had been harder than Becca had anticipated, and she spent much of that time in Cassie and Luke's spare room, because even though she didn't want to be married, it turned out she didn't much like being alone. Eventually, she'd come to embrace her single status, and now she was exploring her options. This exploration seemed to take the form of internet dating on an industrial scale, and the stories of her antics were one of the things that made working at Stonehaven Secondary School quite as enjoyable as it was.
Go on, tell me which hot man you're seeing this week, said Cassie. Let me know what I'm missing out on.
In truth, she didn't think she was missing out on anything. She'd married her first husband too young. She could see that now. She blamed a combination of growing up with disinterested parents and meeting a charismatic charmer when she was at her most vulnerable for the way she'd fallen head over heels in love. It turned out to be a devastating mistake, and following the brutal heartbreak when that ended, she'd been determined never to put her trust in a man again. But that was before she met Luke. He was everything her first husband hadn't been: honest, thoughtful, an open book. Luke's own father had been a compulsive liar. His family and his childhood had been ruined by dishonesty, and he was determined to live his life differently. Cassie had gone into her second marriage with her eyes wide open, but her heart slightly closed. She kept something of herself back, locked in a dark place, that even she hardly ever dared to open.
This week, Becca dropped her chin onto her chest. The cheek! This one isn't fresh out of the box. You could almost say we're dating.
Exclusively?
Let's not get carried away,
Becca said, laughing and flicking her bleached blonde hair over her shoulder dramatically. I'm still exploring your options, Cassie finished for her. Good for you, although I don't know where you find the energy.
It's not easy.
Becca pursed her lips. New men expect a bit more than the ones you've been training for a couple of decades. I even have to wax my bits, did I tell you that? I don't want to know, said Cassie, covering her face with her hand. Please don't give me the details. I've got a visual imagination, and I don't need a picture of your coiffed pubic hair in my head. I had it waxed into a heart shape. I've got a picture. Do you want to see? She picked her phone up and started to scroll. No, I bloody don't, said Cassie, turning away. Spoil sport, Becca laughed and put her phone down. I haven't really got a picture, you idiot, but I have got an appointment with a cauldron of hot wax at 6, so I'm getting these essays out of the way now. She tapped her pen on the pile of papers on the desk in front of her. I can't wait until GCSEs are over. Marking past papers is a form of torture. I hear you. Cassie dug into her cotton bag and dragged out a pile of blue A4 books. If I never see another essay on Lady Macbeth's role in her husband's downfall, it will be too soon. I need to get this lot out of the way before I go home. Alf's got a play date, so I can probably get them done and fit in a quiet glass of wine before Luke picks him up. Right, heads down, said Becca. I'll race you to the finish. An hour later, Cassie's neck was aching from being bent over the pages of books, trying to decipher the scrawling handwriting of some of her Year 11s. She startled at the sound of Becca's pen hitting the wall. I wish she wouldn't do that, she said, It makes me jump every time." She looked across at the wall above the desk Becca invariably used. It was pockmarked from the impact of hundreds of Bic biros being held at force. "It's my little rebellion," said Becca. "You can't take away my small pleasures." "It's criminal damage," said Cassie. "You're ruining that wall. Imagine if you saw a kid in your class do that. You'd go ballistic." Becca stuck out her tongue. "You're such a rule follower. I run a do-as-I-say, not-as-I-do regime. You should know that by now." She narrowed her blue eyes at Cassie. "You do know that if you never do anything wrong, you'll have nothing to go over and over in your head at 3 o'clock in the morning when you're perimenopausal. And then what will you do while you're wide awake? It says in the women's rule book that the hours between 3 a.m. and 4:30 a.m. are to be set aside for overthinking and self-loathing. What about that rule, eh? What are you going to do about that?" She crossed her arms and stuck out her bottom lip. Cassie forced herself to laugh, despite the images springing like firecrackers into her brain. "Maybe I don't have as unblemished a record as you think," she said, closing the exercise books and shoving them into her bag to avoid looking Becca in the eye. "Ha, whatevs," said Becca. "You carry on pretending you had a misspent youth if it makes you feel better, but I know the truth." She tapped the side of her nose. "You can't fool me, little Miss Good Girl." But Cassie could fool Becca, like she'd fooled Luke and everyone else for more than a decade. She was still thinking about that when she opened up her school email account to make sure there was nothing she needed to deal with before the weekend. And that was when she saw the email, from a name that made her heart stall in her chest. Chapter 3. Present Day. Cassie. Cassie waved a limp hand in Becca's direction when she said goodbye and left the staff room, but she couldn't tear her face away from the screen of her laptop. There, at the top of a list of emails, was a name she hadn't seen for almost 14 years. Simon Gately. The room felt suddenly hot. She put a hand to her chest, feeling her heart thundering against her ribcage. The other hand moved the mouse until the cursor pointed to the email, the blue dot by its side signifying it was unread. It could stay that way, she thought, hovering the tiny arrow over her ex-husband's name. She could click on the sidebar, then the little trash bin. 2 taps on the mousepad and this hideous reminder of the past she'd tried so hard to bury could disappear. Focusing her eyes on the subject box, she took in a deep breath, trying to steady her racing pulse. Meg's passing was all it said. Did that mean what she thought it did? Was the woman who had been sleeping with Cassie's husband right back when Cassie had a new life growing inside her actually dead? In that moment, Cassie was frozen, her body in the staff room at Stonehaven, her mind a decade and a half away, at the exact point that set the devastating events rolling. She could see it all as if it was happening in front of her now, playing out like a horror film in her head. She was back there. Her period was 4 days late, so she nipped out at lunchtime and bought a pregnancy test at the local chemist. She peed on the stick in the staff toilets at the school where she'd taught English since graduating. She thought her hand was shaking because she and Simon hadn't been trying for a baby. They were only 25, and although they'd been together since their first year at university, they'd agreed to wait a few years to start a family. But when Cassie watched the second pink line on the test grow stronger and more definite second by second, she was surprised to find elation burst inside her. The nerves were anticipation, not fear. This was unexpected, but now it was real. Cassie knew she wanted this baby more than anything in this world. She was certain Simon would too. He was going to be the best father ever, nothing like her own dad, who was so engrossed in his work during the week and golf at the weekend, he barely registered he had a daughter at all. She and Simon would be a team, the best parents ever. Excitement fizzing inside her, she recapped the test and took out the Ziploc bag, which still held the remains of the sandwich she hadn't felt like eating at lunch. Now that made sense, along with the queasiness and sore boobs she'd been experiencing for a couple of weeks. Dropping the crusts and crumbs into the toilet and the test in the empty bag, she became lightheaded when she imagined presenting it to her husband. She envisioned his face, those lines tracking from his eyes to his mouth deepening with an enormous grin. She struggled her way through lower school drama club, wishing she'd never agreed to fill in for the usual teacher who was off sick. She made all the right noises about their improvisations, reminding them that they should devise a piece that only needed the number of people in their group, not the entire cast of The Prisoner of Azkaban. She looked at the Year 7 and 8 students in a new light. Once upon a time, these living, breathing souls had been a second pink line on a pregnancy test. She hoped their mothers had experienced the same joy as she did right now. She found herself imagining the child inside her at this age, instead of concentrating on the performances at the end of the session, hoping it would have Simon's dazzling blue eyes and her own wavy dark hair. There was so much to look forward to. At last, it was time to leave. Simon was a drama teacher and had rehearsals for a production of Fiddler on the Roof at the school he taught at. The last few had gone on for far longer than they were scheduled to. Then he was playing five-a-side football with friends and wouldn't be home until at least 9. Unable to keep the news to herself, after standing in at drama club, she drove the 20 minutes to the school where he taught. She parked at the far end of the car park at the back of the drama studio, far enough away for Simon not to see her immediately when he came out. She wanted this all to be a great, big, memorable surprise. Since drama was his thing, she would make this monumental occasion as dramatic as she could muster. The front portion of the car park was empty, except for 2 cars. Simon's familiar Peugeot 207 and an old Nissan Micra which had seen better days. Cassie was surprised. She'd expected at least a few parents to be waiting impatiently for their offspring to spill out of rehearsals. She'd been prepared to wait until Simon came out last and locked up so she could surprise him when he was on his own. Maybe they'd finished early today. At least Simon was definitely still there. She put the Ziploc bag with the test into her pocket and reached for the car's handle, just as the door to the drama studio opened. She paused to take in the sight of her gorgeous husband emerging. He was smiling and his eyes were bright. He ran a hand through his hair, thick on top and clipped short at the back and sides by Cassie last weekend. She'd done a good job, she mused. His mouth moved and he glanced over his shoulder. He must be speaking to someone behind him, probably the school caretaker. She took her fingers off the handle. The news bubbling up inside her was for his ears only. She wanted them to be alone when she shared the fact he was about to become a father for the first time. A young woman with a bob ending in sharp points at a striking square jawline stepped onto the tarmac behind Simon. Not the caretaker then. She looked too young to be a teacher, but too old for a pupil. Cassie assumed she must be Meg, the student teacher Simon had mentioned a couple of times. She said something which made Simon laugh and turn towards her. Cassie wished she could see his expression, because something about the way the woman gazed at him unnerved her. Her mouth was slightly pinched and her head lowered, so she was gazing up at Cassie's husband through thick eyelashes. Maybe it was time to reveal herself. Nausea taking her by surprise, Cassie suddenly needed to be out of the hot car. She twisted her body to the door, but before she could move her eyes from the windscreen, the woman glanced around the car park, said something through smiling lips, then took a step towards Simon, closing the gap between them. Cassie froze, unable to compute what was happening when the woman's hands, silver rings on every finger, combed through her husband's hair. Instead of leaping backwards, shouting for her to back off, Simon moved closer. His hand, platinum wedding ring glinting in the light, snaked around the woman's waist, pulling her into him. Cassie watched in horror as his lips met hers, his buttocks clenched as he pushed himself against this stranger. She saw the deepness of the kiss as they stumbled back towards the door, the woman's back pressed against it as Simon pushed his groin into hers, then moved his hands over her breasts. Without her mind processing it, Cassie's hand went to the center of the steering wheel and pressed down hard on the car horn. The pair jumped apart. Simon turned. His gaze landed on Cassie's car. The colour drained from his face. Chapter 4. 6 months ago. Meg. Meg took another sip of water, then lifted her face to the screen. Would she ever get used to seeing a bony skull covered in almost translucent skin staring back at her? Perhaps the ring light was a mistake. She turned it off, but when she looked back at the screen, the kitchen lights above made her sallow cheeks and hooded eyes look like she was wearing Halloween stage makeup. She switched the ring light back on and prepared a smile. To make you understand why we did what we did, I think I need to start with how your dad and I met. Her mind spun back 15 years to when she was still a student teacher who drove a battered Nissan Micra and thought she had her whole life in front of her. If she'd known how that life would turn out, or end, to be more accurate, would she have acted the same way? Of course she would. It was inevitable, irresistible. Despite what you might be thinking now, most of what we've told you is true. I was a student teacher working at the school your dad taught at, but unfortunately, that wasn't the full story. She put her hand to her lips and closed her eyes. Admitting this first lie, even if it was a lie of omission, was one of the most difficult things she'd ever done. She swallowed and looked back at the screen. Before I say more, let me tell you how I felt when I met your father. I know I've told you some of it before, but now you know the context. If you understand how it truly felt, maybe then you'll find it easier to comprehend why we acted the way we did. She smiled weakly, her mind going back to the first time she'd laid eyes on her husband. I remember it so clearly. He had his back to me when I went into the staff room. He was digging in his bag for something. I was with another student teacher who was attached to the PE department. And she was beautiful. I mean, really beautiful. She was the kind of girl who makes you feel invisible when you stand next to her because everyone just gawps at her, you know what I mean? It didn't help that she was always in a skort, so her permatanned legs were out, yelling, "Look at my smooth skin and toned thighs." Meg shimmied her hands and attempted a laugh. Anyway, he turned around and glanced at both of us, and he didn't seem to notice her legs or her mouth with its pink lip gloss. He just looked at me. Remembering the first time she and Simon locked eyes made tears collect behind her own now. Locked was the right word. It was like their vision was set from that moment onwards, and it would only ever truly connect with each other's. I used to have this severe bob that ended about here. Her hand went to her jaw, then touched the fabric of the headscarf at her nape. The understanding that she would never comb her fingers through her own hair again, making her voice hitch. She composed herself. This wasn't the time for self-pity. This was about grace. She dropped her hand. And I wore bright red lipstick, and looking back I can see it was a strong look, especially for teaching practice. I obviously wanted to stand out, but since I was about to spend the next term beside Aphrodite herself, I remember assigning myself the ugly best friend role. Until your dad turned around and looked at me. The moment expanded in her mind. She saw Simon's sandy hair and how the top button of his shirt was undone, his tie askew in a way she would grow to love. But it was his eyes that struck her instantly. They were the brightest blue, and when he smiled, creases began at the corners and tracked down his cheeks all the way to his mouth. Wrinkles shouldn't be attractive, but since his were clearly etched by smiling, she loved every single line, which was lucky since they'd grown deeper in the years they'd spent together. She could read their mutual happiness in those lines. When he looked at me, it was like electricity passed between us. I know it sounds corny, but I swear, Grace, I've never experienced anything like it. She paused. That's not true, I have. The only other time in my life I felt that instant, uncontrollable love was when I first saw you. Chapter 5. Present day. Cassie.
"Got no home to go to?"
said a gruff voice behind Cassie. She jumped, closed the lid of her laptop, and turned to see Jack, the caretaker, standing in the doorway to the staff room, with a bucket in one hand and a mop in the other. Sorry, yes, I was just leaving.
Don't hurry on my account,
said Jack, flapping a blue microfiber cloth at her.
I was pulling your leg. I'll do the loos first if you've got marking to finish.
Cassie zipped the laptop in its case and shoved it in the bag with the books, suddenly desperate to be out in the fresh air. No, it's fine. Thanks. She stumbled in her hurry to leave the room, waving at a confused-looking Jack and wishing him a good weekend, before rushing down the stairs, through reception, and out into the grey afternoon. The day had started as an early spring day should, with bright sunshine and fluffy clouds. But the clouds had gathered during the afternoon, then darkened, and now goosebumps lifted the hairs on Cassie's arms as the chill breeze cut through her thin shirt. Oliver Sims, a boy in Year 9, was standing between her car and the one belonging to the head teacher. He was a sullen teenager, the kind who always had one eye on the teacher so they could get away with nefarious activities and never get caught. Any other day she would have asked him what he was up to, why he was still on school grounds at this time of day. But her head was full of memories, and tears pushed behind her eyes, so she clicked open the car and climbed into the driver's seat. A glint of something bright caught her eye, and she turned her head just as Oliver's hand closed around whatever it was. He scurried away towards the school field. Too lost in her own thoughts to give him any further attention, she started the engine and drove home. Parking next to Luke's Ford Focus on the paved drive of their 1930s semi, she killed the engine and realised she had no memory of travelling home. The only thoughts in her head had been of Simon, Meg, and what happened to the poor baby. She didn't feel ready to face Luke, so she sat in the car and watched light raindrops pepper the windscreen. The clouds burst then, and soon water veiled her view of her front door, with a mesmerising pattern of silver and white, shifting and distorting as water thundered against the car's bonnet. A bang on the window made her jump. She turned to see Luke's face grimacing under an umbrella. "Come on!" he shouted. She opened the door, the sound of the rain thudding against the umbrella, and the driveway suddenly deafening. Luke held the umbrella over her and put his hand on the small of her back. How typical of Luke to see her waiting in the car for the rain to stop and find a way to help her. He stood in the small hallway now, laughing at the sudden downpour, holding the umbrella over the threshold and shaking it.
"I don't blame you for not wanting to get out of the car in that,"
he said. "Thanks," she said, a rush of love for her thoughtful husband, adding to the emotions roiling inside her. "British springtime, eh?"
"How was your day?"
Luke folded the umbrella and threw it in the corner near the door. He always asked how her day was. He always listened while she told him, and for the whole of their marriage, she'd told him the truth. She told him when the man who fixed the photocopier in the staff room asked her out, telling her he didn't mind if she was married, they could still have a bit of fun. She told him when she had made a mistake, forgetting to press record when her exam group did an assessment that was meant to be filmed and go off to the exam board, and they'd had to do the whole thing again, and it wasn't nearly as good. The good and the bad, she told him all of it. "Good, yeah. Nothing much to report." The header on Simon's email seared across her mind's eye. "Bit dull, really. What about you?"
"Quiet day," he said. "I think it's time to start advertising again."
"Oh, I'm sorry to hear that." Cassie hung her damp coat over the banister and kicked off her shoes. Most of Luke's clients came through word of mouth, and he much preferred it that way. She knew he felt like having to advertise was a sign of failure. "On the plus side, it means there are fewer people in the world who need your services, which means everyone is happier, and you've made a significant contribution to that." She squeezed his hand and walked along the hall to the kitchen at the back of the house.
"I like your thinking."
Luke followed her as she took a cold bottle of white wine from the fridge and waved it at him.
"No thanks," he said. "I'll have one when I get back from picking Alf up."
He sighed.
"I feel mean saying it, but if everyone else being happy means we can't pay the bills, that makes one person less happy. Me."
Cassie took a glass from the cupboard and sloshed wine in. "Things aren't that bad, are they?" Money was always tight, since her teacher's salary didn't stretch as far as it might if they lived outside the M25, and Luke's policy of keeping the cost of his therapy sessions as low as possible meant they had to budget. But they didn't have expensive tastes, and they never wanted for anything. She calculated how much the wine in her glass cost, considerably less than if she'd bought it in the pub, and it was still an extravagance. She would miss it if they couldn't afford it, but it was nowhere near as important as Luke's peace of mind. She sat at the kitchen table, next to the patio doors, looking out over their sodden square patch of garden, then back at her husband. We don't have to have the birthday party, if you're worried about money. Luke sat next to her.
It's fine. I'm sure a couple of adverts will solve it. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have mentioned it. I didn't mean to worry you.
She laid her hand over his.